wiggle worms are ahead in the back. And all of our elementary age kids can go in the back table with Joanne. They have some crafts and activities and all kinds of fun things. For those of you who might not know, this is Mike. He is he is a seminary student at Moravian Seminary in Bethlehem, and this is the last time that you'll be leading the message during your time with us. You'll be here with us through Christmas, and then he'll be on to his next field education placement. And just like to say hi to Mike. And it's good that we were able to write the message together today, and so we're going to share it with you. And as a reminder, we have been on this year-long series exploring what our faith is. We've been asking lots and lots of questions like, what's wrong with the world? How do I live? What is a good life? Why is there evil in the world? Why do I sometimes make bad choices? Why do I feel like a slave? What enslaves me, and how can I live as a free person? How can I live more fully into the image of who God has created me to be? We've been asking these deep spiritual questions, and we've been studying our way through the book, We Make the Road by Walking by Brian McLaren. This week is our last week, our 13th week, where we've been studying what it means to be alive in the story of creation. And this week is the last week of this wider conversation, and we're going to reflect on how we can participate in this great conversation about our faith. We're studying the 13th chapter of McLaren's book, and so I want to take a moment to reflect back, because 13 weeks we've covered a lot of information, a lot of territory, a lot of emotions and spiritual questions. At the very beginning, we talked about walking in on the end of a great conversation about our faith. And we imagined it like we're walking into a dinner party late. You know when the dinner party's already going on and everybody is in the middle of a heated conversation, and there have been conversations happening, and you don't know all of what has led everybody to that point. But then you've been welcomed in on the conversation to give your thoughts and input and reflect and your feelings. That's how it is with our faith. It's like walking in late to a dinner party. We don't know all of the conversation which has gone on until now, but we are now invited to participate, to share our questions, our thoughts, our feelings.
In our great conversation about our faith, we have been invited in to reflect on the traditions that ground us and reshape these traditions in a way that continues to speak of the love and mercy of God in meaningful ways to people in our time and place. Today is also an opportunity for us to reflect on where we have been and prepare ourselves for the next stop on our journey. In the coming weeks, we will enter the Advent season. We will explore what it means to be alive in the adventure of Jesus. So now, thinking about where we have been and looking forward to where we are going, we ask, how will you participate in this great conversation? We begin by going back to a time in Israel's history consumed by war and violence. Solomon was the last ruler of the United Kingdom of Israel. After his death, Israel divided into two kingdoms, Israel and Judah. Each kingdom had its own ruler, and they were often in conflict with each other. The larger looming threat came from outside superpowers, empires whose military might and invasions threatened the security of the smaller kingdoms. In 722 BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Assyrian Empire. The smaller kingdom of Judah was now surrounded by superpowers and lived under the constant threat of violence. In the midst of this terror and violence, God calls Isaiah to bring a message to God's people. And we're going to read together a piece of that message. The message Isaiah got
regarding Judah and Jerusalem. There is a day coming when the mountain of God's house will be the mountain, solid, towering over all mountains. All nations will river toward it. People from all over set out for it. They'll say, "Come, let's climb God's mountain. Go to the house of the God of Jacob. He'll show us the way He works, so we can live the way we're made." Zion's the source of revelation. God's message comes from Jerusalem. He'll settle things fairly between nations. He'll lay things right between many peoples. They'll turn their swords into shovels, their spears into hoes. No more will nation fight nation. They won't play war anymore. Come, family of Jacob, let's live in the light of God. In the midst of daily threats of terror and violence, Isaiah the prophet speaks the word of God, speaking out for peace and justice. Did anyone hear economics in that text? Well, economics is an interesting word. Economics comes from a Greek word like ecumenical and ecology. Economics is rooted in the Greek word oikos, which means household, the whole household. And good economic practice is about well-being, the livelihood of the whole household or the whole people of God. Isaiah's people had lived in an economy of scarcity. The people of Israel lived in a subsistence agrarian economy. This means that everyone who would live in their household on their bit of land needed to produce enough food for that day. And food production was absolutely central to life and the well-being of everyone who lived in the household. So decisions have to be made, and that's what economics is all about. How do we make these decisions? Do we live in fear and make costly weapons of war, swords and spears, or do we make tools to help us to grow food in order to survive? So for Isaiah's original audience, for the first people who have heard this scripture, there is a big piece of economic news here. Because in those days, swords and spears were extremely costly, and they would have diverted much needed resources away from food production into weapons, into creating weapons of war. Swords and spears would take away those resources from creating the tools needed to grow food. So while we might create swords and spears and everyone thinks that they're safe, the needs of the household were left unmet. So Isaiah the prophet announces a change is coming.
Like people 2,700 years ago, we also live in an economy of scarcity. How are we managing the well-being of our household? What decisions are we making? What are the impacts of those decisions? This image looks at our aspects of our military spending and what those dollars could have been used to provide. Each B-2 stealth bomber costs over $1 billion. Now, can you imagine what the insurance premiums must be on one of them? provide health insurance coverage for over 67,000 families, or 48,127 four-year college educations. The annual cost of our nuclear weapons program is $52 billion. That money could provide health insurance to almost 3.5 million families.
An economy based on scarcity is rooted in fear. It is not God's economy. Isaiah's prophecy announces God's economy. God's economy is an economy of enough. So while some will question how well we are managing our household, others are working to create God's economy and at the same time stop the violence impacting our communities today. Gun violence is a major problem throughout many cities in our nations, especially in Philadelphia. And in this video that we're going to show this morning, Shane Claiborne talks about the efforts of his community to deal with gun violence, an effort inspired by the words of the prophet Isaiah. So let's watch this video together.
As we look back 10 years after the shock and awe bombing and the war in Iraq, I think we have a duty to remember history or else we're doomed to repeat it. In Philadelphia, I can remember from City Hall, a banner was drawn that said, "Kill them all and let God sort them out." It broke my heart so bad, especially as a Christian. I began to try to wrestle with what the proper response should be. And 10 years ago, I got to go on a delegation to Iraq. When I was in Iraq, I remember in the middle of the bombing, this doctor holding a child that was riddled with missile fragments. And this doctor looked up to the sky as the bombs fell, and he said, "This violence is for a world that has lost its imagination." And he said, "Has your country lost its imagination? Has our world lost its imagination?" And I think a lot of us look back over the last 10 years of war and even the sanctions before that and go, these are failures of imagination. In the New Testament it says, let's not conform to the patterns of this world, but let us be transformed by the renewing of our mind. So let's have a new way of thinking, a new imagination about the way that we live in the world. I'm convinced that one of the things that we need a movement of is a movement of life, of Christians and others who are committed to this idea that every person is precious. I live in Philadelphia, which we have almost one homicide a day. There's been a powerful movement where people of faith and conscience have gathered outside of gun shops and began vigiling, began raising questions about where the kids get the guns. And that started for me not as an issue, a debate around gun control, but it started when a 19-year-old kid was killed on my front porch. And that was what stirred in me this idea that, wow, what is God's dream for the world? I'm pretty sure it's not for one kid to die every day in Philadelphia of gun violence, and not 10,000 people in the United States to die of homicides and gun violence. So let's reimagine our country, let's reimagine the world, because it doesn't have to stay the way it is. In the Bible, the prophets Micah and Isaiah say this. They say, God looks down and says, my people will beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And then nation will not rise up against nation, and people will study war no more. It's this amazing vision of people beating their swords into plows, turning instruments of death into tools for peace and for life. And I love that vision. So much so that we actually met some blacksmiths and some welders that were like, we're ready to do it. So we started doing it. We invited people to donate weapons if they had them, and they wanted to not see them used for death, but to see them converted, to something else. We turned an AK-47 into a rake and a shovel, and then we took another AK-47 and it made 3 little hand trowels. We did the first weapons conversion on the 10th anniversary of September 11th. Now there's people that all over the world have sent us pictures of weapons conversions, so it's snowballing. I think it's a beautiful image.
And it's not just rifles and AK-47s that can be turned into instruments of peace. This is a necklace that Jen brought me. And this necklace is made out of bullets that were refashioned into a piece of jewelry. Now, I've had the opportunity to hear Shane Claiborne speak, and I think it's kind of funny that Dave was talking about Shane coming to speak in December at the walk when we had this Shane Claiborne video lined up. And if you have the opportunity to listen to Shane Claiborne, I highly encourage you to do it. Shane Claiborne's an amazing individual, and he enters into this conversation about being alive in the Spirit of God and answering the call to be alive in that Spirit. Now, I'm not Shane Claiborne. I'm not gifted in the same way. I can't pretend to be him. I have to be Mike Larney, who God has created, and use the gifts and talents God has given me to answer that call. I'm a child of God. I'm filled with power and spirit, and I have the potential to enter into that conversation. But how? And I wonder if you're all asking yourself that same question. How do I enter into that great conversation? Well, the good news is there's many ways we can participate. We can discover the places where our passions meet the world's greatest needs. There's 4 categories that can help us discover our calling. We might be a prophet, a priest, a poet, or a pastor.
A prophet is a person who proclaims a divine message. Now, sometimes prophets tell us future predictions based on current behaviors. But oftentimes a prophet is someone who proclaims a message, a word from God, to people that is rooted in the reality of their time and place. The prophet Isaiah was proclaiming a word from God to his people who were terrorized and torn up from the threats of violence and war. And Isaiah, into the midst of that reality, proclaimed a word of hope. So can you name a prophet? There are prophets among us. Prophets on this screen. Ordinary people can be empowered by God to stand in for God to proclaim a vision, a new imagination of justice and peace in our time and place. That is where they enter into this great conversation.
And this is the part I think I play. It is issues of justice and peace where I feel God's pull in my heart most often. Our second category is priest. Now, this is not a priest, as you may be thinking, in the Roman Catholic Church. In the time of the Reformation, that term was redefined to include all believers with the capacity to read and think through the meaning of Scriptures, the priesthood of all believers. A priest is an intellectual, concerned with the mind, carefully thinking through the philosophical, logical, often scientific reasons to reflect how God is working in our world. Priests make holy things, God things, accessible to all people. Are you or is someone you know a priest, like these examples we have up here on the screen?
I often think I fall into this category because I like to think through my faith. I'm a reader. But it's not enough to just think it through, but how do you make it accessible so that all people have an opportunity to participate in this conversation? And I often find as I'm meeting with someone else and we're talking about these things that it's like God erupts right in the midst of that relationship. It's awesome.
The use of visual arts, poetry, literature, photography, drama, and dance to share God's hope, peace, and love. Poets touch our hearts in meaningful ways that simple words cannot express. Are you an artist? Are you a poet? Examples of poets on the screen. Look at the images in front of us, around us. God is an amazing poet whose work we can see in creation. When we walk through great cathedrals, or we walk into this gathering space and see the creative spirits of our artists at work, they enter into the great conversation and express the beauty of God in this world.
Pastor. A pastor is the breathing heart of compassion in the world. Can you think of someone who is a pastor? You all have an amazing, gifted pastor in Sue. Amazing. But have you ever thought that all of you have the heart of a pastor? You also have the ability, the capability, and the power through the Spirit to be the heart of compassion to one another, to our community, to our world. There are many wonderful pastors among us whose compassion and nurture help to build up the community and to strengthen people's hearts, minds, and souls. So for discussion today, we thought we would throw out a really big question. We've been talking a lot. The question is, how are we managing the well-being of our household? How can you enter into this great conversation? Because I think one of the things that we value at the barn is that we can have many different people who come from many different ways of thinking about the world and interacting in the world, different ways of thinking and believing and seeing and doing. And yet we come together in this great conversation that enriches and stretches and builds up our community. So how are we making these decisions? How are we impacting our world? And how are we participating in this great conversation?
We need many paths toward love, peace, and justice. It is important for us to remain humble as we read the Bible, listen to one another, disagree in love, and hear the many different voices in our Bible as well as in our community. We hope we can find unity in love and creativity in our diversity.
So as we enter into this great conversation, Brian McLaren reminds us, as we read the Bible, it is not to seek ammunition for the side of an argument we already stand on, but to seek the wisdom that comes when we listen humbly to all the different voices arising from the biblical library. And I would add the many different voices, perspectives, and our experiences in our community today. So remember, you are a child of God. You are a child of God filled with power and alive in the Spirit. You can share a word of hope, a word of peace in this world that is desperate for imagination and to hear a word of good news. We can partner with others who want to be hope, love, and peacemakers in our world, in our community. So be love, be peace, be hope, be alive in the Spirit. Amen.
So in the spirit of